Hello everyone, Grandpa Ron here. Today we're going to continue our little basic Bible study series with Genesis 8. And just a reminder, this is really basic for people just starting out, and I will elaborate on a few words and concepts that I think might be confusing, but we're going to try to keep it real basic. Now remember, the last session, Genesis 7, Noah had been faithful to God in earlier chapters in constructing the ark. Took a long time to build it, and during that time I'm sure he received a lot of ridicule. Because if you remember, there had been no rain on the earth up until that time. The earth was kind of like a big giant terrarium, with a vapor canopy above, the oceans beneath, and the ground was watered by a mist, and rivers fed by springs, but there really had never been any rain. And but Noah was faithful. He built the ark. He was faithful to bring the animals into the ark that God brought to him, and supply the ark with food and everything. And in the last chapter we saw that the rains finally came, and that the fountains of the great deep burst up. There was all kinds of volcanic and seismic activity. The water that was contained in the earth itself welled up. The vapor canopy collapsed, and all the high mountains were covered up. Even the mountains that were created during the flood, where you had these great seismic upheavals and thrusting up of the high mountains. And when chapter 7 ended, it said in verse 24, the last verse of chapter 7, and the water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. So now we're have been in the ark 150 days. So before we read the first verse in chapter 8, a lot of people wonder what's going on inside the ark. Is there panic, and is it hard to control the animals, and is it a very fearful place to be? And I don't think so. I'm going to give you some of my opinions. I think that when God brought these animals to Noah to put in the ark, they saw all this food that was stored, and they gorged themselves on it, and God then put them into a state of hibernation, which all animals are capable of. And they were basically slept during this period. So it wasn't a matter of Noah and his family hectically running around trying to tend to and feed all these thousands of animals, but basically they had full stomachs, and they were hibernating. I don't know if any of them reproduced during this time. Some people think they may have. I'll point out why a little bit later. But I think that pretty much the same number that went in came out. But they've been in there a long time. As far as whether it was scary to be in the ark, I don't know. There was a lot of upheavals. We see tsunamis do tremendous amount of damage on coastlines and stuff, but ships out in the ocean, they don't feel that. They just go up and down gently. So it could be that the ark itself, even though it was being pounded by rain, just floated and was not all that turbulent. But we have to recognize it may have been some turbulence with all this seismic upheaval going on and everything. But in my opinion, it probably was not all that terrible being inside the ark. I think God really protected Noah and his family. So let's go on to 8 and see what happens. Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. Now that term remembered doesn't mean that God forgot him and remembered him, but it means that God continued to remember them and provide for all their needs. He took care of them. He didn't forget them. I mean, he was watching out over them the whole time. And this is the first mention of a great wind in the Bible. So that terrarium-like environment that had been experienced up to now, we can see is going away. Now we have a great wind, and the water is starting to subside. Verse 2, also the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained. So the water had reached its apex, and the rain started to subside, and the water receded steadily from the earth. And at the end of 150 days, the water decreased. So we see the water starting to go down now. Now, there's a psalm, and I will include it on the screen, that talks about the water rushing away. And you can imagine with water covering the highest mountains, that when it stopped raining and the fountains of the great deep stopped and the mountains had been thrust up and the soft spots in the earth had been depressed down, that the water started to rush down into those low areas. Verse 4, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. And the water decreased steadily until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. Now, when it talks about these months, it's not talking about they'd been in the ark 10 months, but it's talking about the 10th month of the calendar year. And people have calculated all this out, and we're going to see how long they're actually in the ark by the time we get to the end of the chapter. Verse 6, then it came about at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made, and he sent out a raven, and it flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove from him to see if the water was abated from the face of the land. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot, so she returned to him into the ark, for the water was on the surface of all the earth. Then he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark to himself. So he waited yet another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark, and the dove came to him toward evening, and behold, in her beak was freshly picked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the water was abated from the earth. So Noah and his family, I'm sure they're anxious to get out. I mean, they've been in the ark for a long time, and but God hasn't told him to get out yet. But He's sending out probes. Usually these birds as probes to see what's going on. Is it safe to get out? But God hasn't told him to get out yet. Verse 12, then he waited yet another 7 days and sent out the dove, but she did not return to him again. Now it came about in the 601st year, in the 1st month, on the 1st of the month, the water was dried up from the earth. Then Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground was dried up. He may not have removed the whole top, but he removed enough where he could look out and see that the ground was dried up. Verse 14, and in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. So now God is telling him, okay, you can leave the ark. In fact, I want you to get out of the ark. Verse 17, bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. That tells me that they weren't to multiply and be fruitful in the ark, but now they're to be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by their families from the ark. That phrase, by their families, leads some people to believe that there was some reproduction on the ark. And I won't argue that one way or another. But I think the main reproduction is after they get off of the ark. Verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So the very first thing that Noah does is to thank God through a sacrifice of burnt offerings. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease. So when it says God smelled the soothing aroma, I don't think it was just the smell of the animals burning, but it was the sweet aroma of Noah's sacrifice to him, Noah's thanksgiving and his family's thanksgiving. That was the sweet aroma that God smelled. And there's a covenant here where God makes a promise, and he promises that he'll never destroy the earth again like he's done with this flood. And as long as the earth remains from that date forward, there'll be harvest time and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night. None of that will end. It's going to go on that way as long as the earth remains. So that's a powerful covenant there. If we look back at the calculations, when you look at these times that are mentioned, the months and days of the year, you can calculate out by the end of verse 17, by the end of verse 14, that they were in the ark 371 days, 53 weeks. That's a long time to be in the ark. And I think it'd be a valid inference that even after they got out of the ark, they still had access to things that they had brought in the ark, and it took them a while to unload. But there was probably still food remaining in there. There was probably a lot of tools and things like that remaining in the ark, and they could use it as shelter until they got shelter built on the ground. But basically, their time in the ark was coming to an end. But that's a long time to be in the ark. And just imagine, they went in the ark, and the earth had an environment like a terrarium. And now they come out of the ark, the vapor canopy has collapsed, there's clouds and wind, and there's going to be more rain. There's not going to be an earth-ending catastrophic flood to wipe out all the earth, but there's going to be rain. So the whole climate, everything on the earth has changed for them. It must have been awesome and probably a little frightening to see how things had changed so much. But they were still obedient to the Lord, and we're going to see in the next chapter what the Lord tells them to do now that the flood is over. The other comment I would make is God God's reason for not destroying the earth with a flood every 1,000 years or so is that man's heart is evil. And he could have 1,000 floods, and that's as long as man's on the earth. Floods are not going to solve that sin problem. So there's got to be a different solution. And now we're going to see unfolding in the rest of the Bible the solution to man's sin. And we're going to see that man is going to continue to be sinful, continue to have evil thoughts, and God is going to contend with man for thousands of years, trying to get him to the point where he can trust in his provision for man's sin and God's salvation. So next time we'll start looking at how the population regrows and what happens. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.